On the morning of November 22, 1997, traffic slowed along Avenida Reforma in Tijuana, while a red Ford Explorer rolled toward a routine stoplight with nothing looking out of place. A line of parked cars sat quietly nearby until doors opened at the same time. Then gunmen stepped out holding rifles aimed straight at the vehicle. The driver, Luis Valero, fired back even after taking hits, which kept the engine moving long enough for the man beside him, Jesús Blancornelas, to stay alive. In that exchange, one shooter dropped instantly after a bullet came back the wrong way, ending everything for him right there in the street. That was David Popeye Barron Corona at the end, though the path that brought him there started long before that morning. A kid from two sides. David Barron Corona entered the world on November 8, 1963 in Tijuana, yet his upbringing stretched across the border into Logan Heights in San Diego, where daily life forced young kids to understand two systems at once. That back and forth created a split identity early, since mornings might start in Mexico, while afternoons moved through American streets shaped by heavy industry, freeway cuts, and limited opportunities. By the late 1970s, Logan Heights had become a dense working-class neighborhood where unemployment ran high, public investment stayed low, and groups of young men formed crews for protection rather than status. Those early crews started as lowrider clubs, where customized Chevys rolled through Chicano Park, though over time that scene shifted into something tighter, more territorial, and more organized. As those groups evolved, names like Calle Treinta, Red Steps, and Logan Heights 13 began defining blocks rather than just friendships, while older members passed down rules about loyalty, respect, and retaliation. Younger kids watched that structure form, so they learned quickly that staying neutral rarely worked once lines were drawn across streets, alleys, and schoolyards. David Barron moved through that environment without making noise, since people who knew him later described someone who listened more than he spoke, though when he acted, he did not hesitate. That combination of quiet presence and sudden decision-making set him apart from louder personalities who tried to prove themselves through constant attention. By 1979, when Barron turned 16, that difference showed clearly during a small confrontation outside his home on 30th Street in Logan Heights, where a man sat in his car and refused to move when asked. Instead of arguing or escalating through back-and-forth tension, Barron pulled a gun and fired once, killing the man instantly, which shocked even people used to neighborhood violence. Police responded quickly, arrested him, then pushed the case through court, where he received a conviction that sent him into the California Youth Authority before transitioning into the adult prison system. That moment became his entry point into a much larger network, since incarceration during that era operated less like punishment and more like a sorting system for organized crime. Inside those facilities during the early 1980s, racial divisions controlled everything from housing assignments to daily movement, which meant survival depended on aligning with structured groups rather than acting alone. For Latino inmates from Southern California, that structure pointed toward La M, also known as the Mexican Mafia, a prison organization that controlled drug flow, enforced discipline, and extended influence far beyond cell blocks. Barron entered that environment young, though his prior act of violence already carried weight, so older members viewed him as someone who understood consequences without needing long explanations. Through that lens, he received guidance on how power operated within both prison and street systems, where loyalty ranked higher than impulse and silence mattered as much as action. While time passed inside, Barron adjusted to that system, learning how orders moved from senior members to younger associates, how communication stayed coded, and how punishment enforced compliance when rules were broken. He did not chase attention during those years, since building credibility quietly often carried more value than drawing notice from guards or rival groups. That approach allowed him to develop connections that extended into outside networks, since La M maintained relationships with street gangs and cross-border operators who handled trafficking routes. By the time he moved through different facilities, his name carried recognition among certain circles, though that recognition came without the usual noise attached to reputation building. After serving time, Barron returned briefly to the streets, though another arrest in 1987 on weapons charges sent him back into custody, this time in Arizona, where a different connection shifted his path again. Inside that system, he met Oscar Paz, who held ties to Arturo Paez Martinez, a figure connected to the Tijuana cartel structure that had grown stronger after Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo's organization fractured. That meeting mattered since Paz recognized Barron's background, his bilingual ability, and his understanding of both American street culture and Mexican criminal networks. Instead of staying limited to local gang activity, Barron now stood near an entry point into something larger, where operations crossed borders and stakes moved beyond neighborhood disputes. When he eventually left custody in the late 1980s, the person who stepped out differed from the teenager who entered years earlier, since his decisions now carried more calculation rather than impulse. He no longer reacted quickly to minor disrespect, since he understood timing, positioning, and long-term consequences in ways shaped by prison hierarchy. That shift made him more valuable to organizations seeking disciplined operators rather than unpredictable shooters, especially during a period when cross-border trafficking required coordination between American citizens and Mexican leadership. As that transition began, Barron moved toward Tijuana with a new role forming, though at that stage, he remained just another name entering a system that would test how far that discipline could carry him. The connection that changed everything. When David Barron Corona went back into custody in 1987 on weapons charges in Arizona, his second stretch behind bars placed him in a different environment where new connections carried more weight than his previous reputation. Inside that facility, he met Oscar Paz, whose brother Arturo Paez Martinez, known as El Kitty, operated within the Tijuana cartel structure under the Arellano Felix organization. That link mattered immediately, since Paz saw in Barron someone who already understood discipline from Mexican mafia influence, while also moving comfortably between English and Spanish without friction. During long stretches inside, conversations shifted from small talk to opportunity, as Paz described how the cartel needed operators who could function on both sides of the border without attracting attention. Barron listened more than he spoke during those exchanges, yet his silence signaled interest, which allowed Paz to introduce his name upward once the timing aligned. At the same time, the larger drug landscape shifted after Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's arrest in 1989 fractured the Guadalajara cartel into competing factions, with the Arellano Felix brothers taking control of the Tijuana corridor. Benjamin Arellano Felix handled strategy and money, while Ramon Arellano Felix enforced control through violence, which created a structure that relied on both planning and intimidation to maintain dominance. That setup required people who could move through San Diego without drawing attention, since cross-border trafficking depended on blending into everyday American environments rather than standing out as cartel operatives. Barron fit that need precisely, since he carried U.S. familiarity alongside Mexican ties, and his prison history proved he could follow orders without hesitation. As that demand grew, Paz positioned Barron as a solution to a problem the cartel had not fully solved yet, which opened the door for him to step into something bigger than street-level work. After leaving prison in 1989, Barron crossed south into Tijuana instead of returning fully to Logan Heights, where he entered the Arellano Felix network at a lower level as a bodyguard assigned to protect key figures during meetings, movements, and public appearances. That role placed him close to Benjamin and Ramon, allowing him to observe how decisions moved from leadership down to operatives, while also showing how violence supported business rather than replacing it. Early assignments involved driving, escorting, and maintaining perimeter awareness, which did not carry glory but built trust through consistency. Barron handled those responsibilities without drawing attention, since he focused on staying alert rather than proving himself through unnecessary action, which matched the expectations of Ramon, who valued reliability over noise. Over time, that steady approach kept Barron within the inner circle, where he began to see how larger operations came together. Training followed soon after, as Barron spent time on ranches outside Tijuana, where cartel recruits learned weapons handling, coordinated movement, and tactical communication under instructors tied to corrupt Mexican federal police units. Sessions covered AK-47 use, handgun control, convoy coordination, and escape planning, which turned street shooters into more organized operators capable of executing structured missions. Some accounts mentioned a foreign instructor referred to as El Terrorista, who introduced more advanced techniques involving explosives and small unit tactics, though details about that figure remained unclear. Regardless of origin, the training pushed Barron into a higher level of readiness, where decisions needed precision rather than instinct, since mistakes carried consequences beyond individual survival. He absorbed those lessons quietly, rarely asking questions, though his performance during drills showed he understood expectations without needing repetition. As months passed, Barron's position strengthened, since he stayed close to Ramon Arellano Felix during movements through Tijuana nightlife, safe houses, and private meetings where security remained tight. He watched how Ramon operated, noting patterns in behavior, reactions to threats, and the way violence got deployed strategically rather than randomly. That observation period mattered since Barron built his approach by studying leadership directly instead of relying on instruction alone, which gave him an edge when situations turned unpredictable. By 1991, he was no longer just another guard standing watch, since his name circulated among other operatives as someone dependable under pressure. That reputation kept him positioned near key decisions, where he could see how the organization prepared for conflict with rivals like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, whose growing presence threatened the Tijuana corridor. Through that transition, Barron filled the exact gap the cartel needed, since he combined discipline from prison systems with adaptability from border life, which allowed him to operate across environments without breaking pattern. He did not rush into leadership, though his placement near Benjamin and Ramon meant he stayed involved in conversations that shaped upcoming operations, including growing tensions with Sinaloa forces. That proximity set the stage for his next moment, since being close to leadership meant he would be present when pressure arrived unexpectedly. By late 1992, Barron stood fully embedded within the Arellano Felix organization, not as a figurehead but as a trusted operator ready for situations that would test everything he had learned so far. The night that built his name. On November 8, 1992, the Christine discotheque in Puerto Vallarta filled with music, alcohol, and high-profile guests celebrating Benjamin Arellano Felix's birthday, while cartel members relaxed under heavy security. Ramon Arellano. Felix stayed close to the center of the room, surrounded by trusted men, while David Barron Corona moved along the edges, watching faces instead of enjoying the party. That environment looked controlled on the surface, though outside the club, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had already gathered a team of armed men who tracked the brothers' location through informants. As the night moved past midnight, those gunmen approached the venue dressed in Mexican Federal Police uniforms, which allowed them to move toward the entrance without raising immediate suspicion. Once inside, their formation shifted from casual movement to coordinated positioning, which signaled that the celebration had turned into a setup. Barron noticed the change early, since the men entering did not react to music, drinks, or women, and their focus stayed fixed on scanning the room rather than blending into the crowd. That difference pushed him into alert mode immediately, since his role required reading threats before they fully developed, and he understood that uniform disguises often covered intent. As those men spread out, weapons came up without warning, and automatic gunfire cut through the club, hitting walls, tables, and people who had no time to react. Panic followed instantly as guests dropped to the floor or rushed toward exits, while security members scrambled to locate attackers inside the chaos. Barron did not freeze during that moment, since he moved toward the nearest fallen gunman, grabbed an AK-47, and returned fire to disrupt the attackers' momentum. That response created a brief opening, which he used to reach Ramon Arellano Felix and push him away from the center of the club toward a bathroom corridor where fewer shooters had direct sight lines. Benjamin Arellano Felix remained exposed near the main area, which forced Barron to move back into the line of fire to reach him while bullets continued hitting walls and furniture. He pulled Benjamin through the crowd despite the chaos, using his body to shield movement while navigating toward the same bathroom space where Ramon waited. Once inside, the situation stayed unstable since gunfire continued outside the door, which meant staying inside would not hold for long. Barron looked upward, saw a window leading toward the roof, and shifted the escape plan without hesitation, since vertical movement offered a path away from the attackers' direct angles. He pushed Ramon through first, then worked to get Benjamin through the opening, which required effort due to his size, though urgency forced speed over comfort. Once both men reached the roof, Barron followed, moving across tiles under low visibility while shots still echoed from below, which kept pressure on every step forward. The roof led toward a tree positioned near the back of the structure, which provided a way down, though the descent carried risks since attackers could reposition outside. Barron guided both brothers toward that exit, helping them climb down one at a time while staying alert for movement at ground level. When they reached the alley, a gunman stood waiting with a raised weapon, which forced Barron into a direct confrontation that ended with him firing first and neutralizing the threat. After that exchange, he secured a vehicle and moved the brothers away from the immediate area, directing them toward a location where they could regroup under protection from contacts within local law enforcement. That should have ended his involvement, though Barron did not stay with them since he turned back toward the club despite the danger still unfolding. Returning to the scene meant re-entering a firefight where visibility remained low and confusion stayed high. though his objective shifted toward ensuring no remaining attackers could regroup or follow the escape path. Inside, the situation had already taken heavy losses, as multiple AFO members lay dead alongside civilians caught in crossfire while surviving attackers pulled back under pressure. By the time military units arrived, the shooting had ended, leaving behind bodies, damaged interiors, and a clear message that the conflict between cartels had escalated openly. Reports from that night confirmed several fatalities, including cartel members and bystanders, while others were left injured, though the key outcome remained that Benjamin and Ramon survived an attack designed to eliminate them. That survival changed Barron's position immediately, since his actions during the incident demonstrated control under pressure rather than reckless aggression, which aligned with the organization's needs. Benjamin recognized that performance publicly within his circle, reinforcing Barron's standing among other operatives who had witnessed the outcome. Ramon, known for valuing loyalty and effectiveness, kept Barron close after that night, since trust became tied directly to survival. Within a short period, Barron received a promotion that moved him beyond bodyguard duties into a leadership role overseeing enforcement operations. Along with that shift came a code name Charlie, referencing Charles Bronson, which reflected how the organization viewed his approach to violence and responsibility within their structure. That name carried weight internally, since it signaled both recognition and expectation, meaning future operations would fall under his direction rather than observation. He gained authority over planning, recruitment input, and execution strategy, which positioned him as a central figure in upcoming conflicts with rival groups. That moment marked a clear transition, since Barron moved from reacting to threats to shaping responses, which placed him deeper into the organization's core structure. By the end of 1992, his role had changed completely, and the next phase of his path focused on building something that extended beyond individual actions into an organized force, building the American Hit Squad. After the Christine nightclub incident in November 1992, Benjamin Arellano Felix shifted David Barron Corona into a role that required building a crew capable of operating across both Mexico and the United States without attracting attention. That assignment focused on solving a specific problem, since Mexican sicarios struggled to move freely in San Diego while local gangs lacked coordination for structured operations. Barron understood that gap clearly, since his background in Logan Heights gave him direct access to young men who already understood street codes while lacking direction. Instead of recruiting broadly, he returned to Barrio Logan with a targeted approach, looking for individuals who followed instructions rather than chasing recognition. That selection process mattered early, since the goal involved building consistency rather than assembling a group driven by ego. He approached known figures from Calle Treinta and nearby cliques, including members connected to Red Steps and Logan Heights 13, while offering a deal that sounded different from typical street arrangements. Weekly payments of around $500 created immediate interest, since legitimate work in the early 1990s rarely matched that amount for young men without stable employment. On top of that base pay, Barron added bonuses tied to specific assignments, which introduced a structured incentive system that pushed recruits toward performance rather than random activity. He also promised housing in Tijuana, access to vehicles, and protection through cartel connections, which shifted their outlook from survival toward stability within a criminal framework. Those offers brought in recruits like Martin Corona, Steve Duncan, and other Logan Heights members who saw the opportunity as a step beyond local disputes. Once recruits agreed, Barron moved them across the border into Tijuana, where training took place on ranches located outside the city, guarded by armed personnel who controlled entry and exit points. Those sessions focused on transforming street shooters into coordinated units, which meant teaching weapons handling alongside communication protocols that allowed multiple teams to operate together. Recruits learned how to handle AK-47 rifles, pistols, and grenades, while also practicing movement through urban environments where visibility could shift quickly. Instructors included corrupt Mexican federal police officers who brought formal tactics into the process, which added structure that street experience alone could not provide. Some accounts also mentioned a foreign trainer referred to as El Terrorista, who introduced additional methods involving explosives and coordinated attacks, though details about that individual remained limited. Barron enforced discipline from the beginning, since he knew that a lack of control would break operations quickly once pressure increased from law enforcement or rival groups. He banned drug use during active involvement, which separated his crew from many street-level groups that operated under substance influence, since he believed clarity mattered during execution. Alcohol consumption remained limited, while daily routines included physical drills and weapons practice designed to maintain readiness across all members. Violations of those rules triggered consequences that escalated based on severity, starting with isolation in designated holding spaces and moving toward physical punishment when behavior was repeated. Stories circulated among recruits that repeated violations could lead to execution, which reinforced the seriousness of expectations without requiring constant enforcement. Beyond discipline, Barron introduced a detail that changed how the group operated, which involved controlling how members looked during movement across the border. Instead of allowing traditional gang clothing, he required recruits to wear polo shirts, dockers, and clean shoes, while keeping haircuts neat and avoiding visible tattoos. That shift created a visual identity that blended into everyday environments, since individuals dressed that way could move through San Diego without drawing attention from police or border officials. The strategy relied on perception, since officers often looked for obvious signs of gang affiliation rather than individuals who appeared organized and ordinary. By adjusting appearance, Barron reduced friction at crossing points, which allowed his crew to move equipment, gather information, and position themselves without immediate suspicion. That approach turned the squad into a mobile unit capable of operating in both countries, since members could cross into the United States for assignments, then return to Tijuana for regrouping without triggering alarms. Vehicles used during operations included standard sedans and vans, which avoided patterns that might suggest organized activity, while communication relied on radios and pagers that allowed coordination across distances. Barron structured teams into smaller groups that could handle specific tasks, including surveillance, execution, and extraction, which increased efficiency during missions. That organization moved the crew beyond a loose collection of individuals into a functioning system where each role supported the overall objective. As operations increased, that structure proved effective since tasks could be completed with less confusion and fewer mistakes. By early 1993, the group had grown to roughly 30 members, which matched Barron's initial target for a unit that could handle multiple assignments simultaneously without losing control. Each member understood expectations, since training reinforced both technical skills and behavioral standards that guided movement during operations. That clarity reduced internal conflict, which often weakened other groups where leadership remained inconsistent or unclear. Barron maintained authority directly, though he also relied on trusted figures within the crew to manage smaller teams, which allowed him to oversee broader planning. That layered structure kept operations moving smoothly even when he was not physically present at every stage. The squad's reputation developed quickly, since their ability to move quietly while executing precise actions separated them from less organized groups operating in the same region. Law enforcement began noticing patterns tied to Logan Heights members, though linking those actions directly to the Arellano Felix organization proved difficult at first due to the group's controlled appearance and coordinated movement. Rival groups also recognized the shift, since attacks carried more structure and less randomness compared to previous confrontations. Barron's approach emphasized results over visibility, which meant operations focused on outcomes rather than sending public messages unless directed otherwise. That mindset kept attention lower while still achieving objectives tied to cartel interests. As months passed, the crew's activities expanded beyond initial assignments, including surveillance of rival figures, enforcement actions against local targets, and preparation for larger operations tied to ongoing conflicts with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's network. Their ability to operate across borders gave them an advantage, since they could gather information in San Diego while executing actions in Mexico or vice versa. That flexibility allowed the Arellano Felix organization to extend its reach without relying solely on local operatives who might lack access to certain areas. Barron's role in shaping that system placed him at the center of cross-border operations, where coordination mattered more than individual acts of violence. By mid-1993, the Logan Heights unit had become a recognized part of the cartel's enforcement structure, though its internal identity remained controlled and focused on discipline rather than image. Members followed Barron's rules closely, since deviation carried consequences that reinforced order, which kept the group aligned even as pressure increased from outside forces. That cohesion allowed them to handle assignments that required timing and coordination rather than impulsive action, which positioned them differently from other groups operating in the same environment. Barron did not present the unit publicly, though within the organization, their value remained clear since they filled a role that few others could match. Through that process, Barron achieved what the cartel leadership required, which involved creating a force that moved between two countries while maintaining operational consistency under pressure. His focus on discipline, appearance, and coordination transformed local gang members into a structured unit capable of handling complex assignments without drawing unnecessary attention. That development marked a peak in his rise, since he now controlled not just actions, but an entire system built around his approach. As that system expanded, the next phase brought challenges that tested whether control could hold when situations became less predictable. When control starts to slip. By early 1993, pressure inside the Arellano Felix organization shifted toward a direct objective, which focused on eliminating Joaquin El Chapo Guzman as tensions escalated across northern Mexico. Intelligence gathered through informants placed Guzman near Guadalajara International Airport on May 24, 1993, which created an opportunity that Barron's unit prepared to exploit. Barron coordinated multiple vehicles carrying Logan Heights shooters, positioning them around the airport roads where arrivals slowed due to traffic flow. The plan relied on identifying Guzman's vehicle quickly, then executing a controlled ambush before security forces could respond effectively. As that setup moved into place, the group waited for confirmation, since timing determined whether the operation succeeded or collapsed under confusion. When a white Grand Marquis entered the area, spotters signaled that the target had arrived, which triggered the attack without further delay. Gunmen stepped out carrying AK-47 rifles, then opened fire toward the vehicle, which immediately drew attention from civilians and nearby security personnel. Bullets struck the car repeatedly, while additional shots spread across the surrounding area, hitting bystanders who had no connection to the operation. Inside that vehicle sat Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, Archbishop of Guadalajara, who had arrived at the airport to meet a church delegation. That identification mistake transformed the operation instantly, since the intended target had not been present, while a high-profile religious figure became the victim of sustained gunfire. As the shooting continued, chaos expanded across the airport since civilians ran for cover while vehicles collided during attempts to escape the scene. Additional victims fell during those moments, including the Cardinal's driver and several others caught in crossfire, which increased the scale of the incident beyond a targeted hit. Barron's team pulled back quickly once the situation became uncontrollable, though the damage had already spread far beyond the original objective. News of the incident moved rapidly across Mexico, since killing a Catholic cardinal carried significance that extended beyond cartel conflict into national attention. Within hours, media outlets reported multiple fatalities, while officials confirmed the identity of Posadas Ocampo, which intensified the reaction immediately. That outcome triggered pressure from both the Mexican government and the Catholic Church, which demanded accountability for the killing of a senior religious figure during what appeared to be a coordinated attack. Investigations began under intense scrutiny, though early statements from officials framed the incident as a case of mistaken identity during a confrontation between rival criminal groups. Church representatives questioned that explanation, pointing toward evidence that suggested targeted gunfire rather than accidental crossfire, which fueled debate about what had truly happened. Meanwhile, international attention increased, since the scale of the event drew coverage from outlets in the United States and Europe, which placed additional focus on the Tijuana cartel's activities. Inside the Arellano Felix organization, leadership moved to manage fallout by denying direct involvement and shifting blame toward lower-level participants who could be sacrificed if necessary. 2 gunmen were eventually handed over to authorities as part of that response, which allowed the cartel to create distance between leadership and the incident. Barron, however, remained identified by investigators as a central figure tied to the operation, which placed him under increased scrutiny from both Mexican and United States agencies. That attention forced adjustments within his unit, since movement patterns that once worked now carried a higher risk under surveillance. Crossing the border became more complicated, since officials began watching for connections between Logan Heights members and violent incidents linked to cartel activity. As that pressure built, Barron reorganized operations to reduce visibility, which meant limiting large movements and breaking teams into smaller units that could operate independently. Safe houses shifted locations more frequently, while communication relied on tighter channels to avoid interception by law enforcement. Despite those adjustments, internal stress began affecting members, since the scale of the Guadalajara incident created fear alongside increased expectations for performance. Some recruits struggled to maintain discipline under that pressure, which led to behavior that conflicted with Barron's earlier standards. Reports circulated of individuals using drugs despite clear rules, while others carried out actions without direct authorization, which disrupted the structure he had built. Violence continued during that period, though it became less controlled as operations expanded beyond focused assignments into broader retaliation and enforcement. Barron's unit participated in bomb attempts targeting rival figures, including an incident involving an explosive device intended for a hotel in Guadalajara, which detonated prematurely and caused unintended casualties. Street-level killings also increased, with Logan Heights members involved in shootings across San Diego and Tijuana tied to disputes over territory and influence. Personal vendettas entered the mix as well, since some actions reflected individual motives rather than organized directives, which weakened overall coordination. That shift marked a change from precision toward unpredictability, which increased risk across all operations. At the same time, law enforcement agencies began connecting patterns between incidents, since similar weapons, tactics, and suspect profiles appeared across multiple cases. Cooperation between U.S. agencies such as the DEA and FBI and Mexican authorities increased, which allowed information sharing that narrowed the focus on specific individuals. Barron's name surfaced more frequently in those discussions, which placed him among targets of ongoing investigations tied to cross-border violence. Surveillance intensified in areas linked to Logan Heights members, while informants provided additional insight into how the group operated. That combination of pressure from both sides of the border limited flexibility, since movement required more planning to avoid detection. Within the crew, discipline continued slipping among certain members, since extended exposure to violence and pressure affected decision-making in ways that training alone could not control. Barron attempted to enforce standards through stricter oversight, though the size of the group made complete control difficult once fractures appeared. Some individuals reverted to behavior typical of street-level gangs, which introduced unpredictability that conflicted with the unit's original purpose. That erosion of discipline reduced efficiency, since operations required more correction and supervision than before. As those issues grew, the difference between the structured unit Barron created and the reality of its current state became more noticeable. By late 1993 into 1994, Barron faced a situation where external pressure from law enforcement combined with internal instability, which challenged his ability to maintain control over both operations and personnel. The Guadalajara airport incident remained a central point in investigations, which kept attention focused on the network he helped build. That focus limited options for expansion, since every movement carried an increased risk of exposure or interception. Despite those constraints, operations continued, though each new action added strain to a system already under pressure. That phase marked the beginning of a shift where control no longer rested fully in Barron's hands, setting up the next stage where consequences extended beyond individual decisions. The war closes in. By 1996 into 1997, pressure around the Arellano Felix organization shifted from quiet investigation into public exposure, which placed names, faces, and operations into circulation through investigative journalism. Jesús Blancornelas, co-founder of Zeta magazine in Tijuana, had built a reputation for publishing detailed reports on cartel activity despite repeated threats and earlier attacks against his staff. His coverage included connections between the Tijuana cartel, local politicians, and violent incidents that authorities often downplayed, which made his work a direct problem for the organization. On November 21, 1997, Zeta released a report identifying a figure known as CH as being involved in recent killings tied to federal judicial police officers, while that name pointed toward David Barron Corona. That publication shifted Barron from a hidden operator into a public target, since his identity now circulated beyond law enforcement circles into general awareness. Inside the cartel, that exposure triggered immediate concern, since Blancornelas had crossed a line by naming individuals tied to enforcement operations, rather than speaking in general terms. Ramon Arellano Felix viewed that move as a direct threat to the organization's security, since public identification increased pressure from both authorities and rival groups. Discussions among leadership focused on removing that threat quickly, which aligned with previous actions taken against journalists who had reported too closely on cartel operations. The decision was formed around eliminating Blancornelas, since allowing continued reporting risked further exposure that could disrupt ongoing activities. That directive placed Barron at the center again, since his role as an enforcer positioned him to carry out operations that required coordination and precision under pressure. Planning began almost immediately after the article's release, which involved gathering detailed information about Blancornelas' daily routine, including travel routes between his home and the Zeta office in Tijuana. Surveillance teams tracked his movements over several days, noting patterns in departure times, vehicle types, and security presence, which allowed the group to identify moments where intervention could occur. Barron oversaw that process directly, since controlling timing and positioning mattered more than speed during this stage, especially with increased attention from authorities. Informants within local networks provided additional insight into schedule adjustments, which helped refine the plan further as details became clearer. That preparation reflected a shift from reactive operations toward controlled execution, since mistakes at this stage would carry immediate consequences. As the plan developed, Barron assembled a team of gunmen drawn from his existing network, including individuals with prior experience in coordinated attacks rather than new recruits who lacked discipline. Weapons selection focused on automatic rifles capable of delivering sustained fire, while vehicles were chosen to blend into Tijuana traffic without attracting attention. Barron emphasized positioning during the briefing, since controlling angles and escape routes determined whether the operation would succeed without capture. Each participant received a defined role, which reduced confusion once execution began, though pressure remained high given the visibility of the target. That structure reflected lessons learned from previous operations, where a lack of coordination had led to unintended outcomes. Movement toward execution became more complicated due to increased scrutiny from both Mexican authorities and U.S. agencies, which had intensified monitoring of individuals connected to Logan Heights and cross-border violence. Informants within law enforcement networks created uncertainty, since information leaks could expose plans before they unfolded, which forced Barron to adjust timelines repeatedly. Despite those risks, the organization maintained trust in his ability to manage the operation, since his track record still held weight within leadership circles. That trust came with higher stakes, since failure would not only affect the target but also his standing within the cartel structure. Barron understood that expectation, which added a personal dimension to the assignment beyond organizational directives. On November 22, 1997, the plan moved into action along Avenida Reforma in Tijuana, where Blancornelas traveled in a red Ford Explorer accompanied by his bodyguard, Luis Valero Elizalde. Barron's team positioned vehicles along the route, waiting for the moment when traffic slowed enough to limit movement and create a controlled environment for the attack. Once the target entered the designated zone, gunmen stepped out and opened fire with automatic weapons, directing rounds toward the vehicle while maintaining coverage across the area. Valero responded by returning fire despite sustaining multiple gunshot wounds, which disrupted the attacker's positioning and extended the engagement beyond its intended duration. Blancornelas suffered injuries but remained alive, which immediately altered the outcome from a planned execution into a contested confrontation. During that exchange, one of the bullets fired by the attackers struck a surface and ricocheted back toward the group, hitting Barron in the head and killing him instantly. That moment ended his role within the operation without warning, leaving the remaining gunmen to react without centralized direction. The team withdrew quickly from the scene, abandoning Barron's body on the street, which remained unattended due to fear among bystanders who recognized him. Valero died from his injuries after the exchange, though his actions prevented the attackers from completing the objective, while Blancornelas survived despite multiple wounds. That outcome shifted the narrative immediately, since the intended target lived while the operations leader died under circumstances that none of the participants had anticipated. In the aftermath, authorities recovered evidence linking the attack to the Arellano Felix organization, which intensified investigations already underway due to earlier incidents tied to Barron's network. Media coverage highlighted the survival of Blancornelas alongside the death of Barron, which brought additional attention to the group's activities and structure. Within the cartel, his death created a gap in enforcement leadership, though operations continued under other figures who stepped into roles previously managed by him. The exposure generated by the failed assassination increased pressure across the network, since connections between individuals and incidents became easier to trace under sustained scrutiny. That moment marked a turning point where the system Barron helped build continued operating, though the man who shaped it no longer remained part of its structure. Full circle. By late November 1997, the ambush on Avenida Reforma had already been planned down to movement, timing, and positioning, which reflected the same structure David Barron Corona had applied throughout earlier operations. Vehicles sat parked along the route in Tijuana, chosen to blend into regular traffic while providing clear angles toward the target's expected path. Each participant understood their role before the moment arrived, since Barron had always emphasized coordination over improvisation when pressure increased. That preparation allowed the team to stay in place without drawing attention, even as the city moved normally around them during a late morning that gave no signal of what would follow. As the plan reached execution, the setup mirrored previous operations that had worked under his direction, which meant everything depended on timing rather than force alone. When Jesús Blancornelas entered the zone in a red Ford Explorer driven by Luis Valero Elizalde, traffic slowed enough to create the opening Barron had been waiting for, which triggered the attack immediately. Gunmen stepped out from their positions and opened fire using AK-47 rifles, directing rounds toward the vehicle while maintaining coverage across the street to prevent escape. Valero reacted quickly despite being outnumbered, returning fire while attempting to maneuver the vehicle out of the kill zone, which disrupted the attacker's positioning. Blancornelas sustained multiple gunshot wounds during that exchange, though he remained conscious, which kept the situation from ending as intended. That resistance extended the encounter beyond the planned time frame, which increased exposure for everyone involved. During that exchange, one of the rounds fired by the attackers struck a surface and deflected back toward the shooters, which created an outcome that none of them had anticipated when planning the operation. That ricocheted bullet struck Barron in the head, ending his life instantly and removing the central figure directing the attack in the middle of execution. Without his presence, coordination broke down, since the remaining gunmen had to react independently rather than following a controlled sequence. They withdrew quickly from the scene, leaving behind Barron's body on the pavement, which reflected how quickly priorities shifted from completing the mission to avoiding capture. That decision to leave him marked a stark contrast to the control he had maintained during earlier operations, where every detail had been managed tightly. Valero continued resisting until his injuries became fatal, though his actions prevented the attackers from completing their objective, which allowed Blancornelas to survive despite sustaining multiple wounds. Emergency services arrived shortly after, transporting the wounded journalist to medical care while securing the area as investigators began documenting evidence. Barron's body remained at the scene initially, since fear among witnesses prevented immediate identification or response, even though some individuals recognized him. That hesitation reflected the reputation he had built over the years, where association with his name carried risk that extended beyond the moment itself. As authorities processed the scene, his identity was confirmed, which linked the attack directly to the network he had helped construct. In the aftermath, searches connected to Barron's residence uncovered large sums of cash hidden within walls and furniture, which indicated the financial scale tied to his role within the organization. Family members moved quickly to secure those assets, transferring money across the border before authorities could seize everything connected to him. That movement showed how established systems continued operating even after his death, since resources did not remain tied to one individual alone. Investigators also used the incident to strengthen cases linking Logan Heights members to cross-border operations, which increased pressure on individuals previously connected to his unit. Media coverage expanded rapidly, focusing on the survival of Blancornelas alongside the death of Barron, which created a narrative that highlighted both the reach and the limits of cartel enforcement. Despite that outcome, the broader conflict between the Arellano Felix organization and rival groups continued without interruption, since one individual's death did not alter the structure driving those operations. Leadership roles shifted among remaining figures, while enforcement actions continued using the systems already in place before Barron's death. His unit, though affected by his absence, did not disappear, since members remained active within cartel operations that extended across both sides of the border. That continuity demonstrated how the model he built functioned independently once established, which meant its effectiveness did not rely entirely on his presence after a certain point. As a result, his death marked a change in personnel rather than a collapse of the system itself. American gang members continued playing roles within cartel activities, especially in areas requiring movement through the United States without attracting attention, which reinforced the value of the approach Barron had developed earlier. Dressing recruits in clean clothing, maintaining discipline, and structuring operations allowed those individuals to blend into environments where traditional cartel operatives might stand out. That method persisted, since it addressed a logistical challenge that remained relevant beyond his lifetime, which ensured its continued use by others within the organization. Law enforcement agencies recognized that pattern as well, which influenced how investigations targeted individuals connected to cross-border violence. Even so, the adaptability of that system made complete disruption difficult, since it relied on blending rather than visibility. Over time, Barron's story became tied to larger discussions about how cartel operations evolved during the early 1990s, particularly in relation to integrating American gang members into structured enforcement roles. His path from Logan Heights to Tijuana illustrated how local street dynamics could scale into organized systems when combined with resources and leadership from cartel networks. That transition did not occur in isolation, since broader conditions in both regions supported the development of such connections, which extended beyond individual decisions. As those dynamics continued shaping operations, Barron's role remained part of that history, even after his death removed him from active involvement. In the end, the arc of his life returned to the same point where the story began, since the ambush on Avenida Reforma both reflected his methods and exposed their limits under unpredictable conditions. He had built a system based on discipline, coordination, and control, though that system could not account for every variable during execution, especially when resistance altered the flow of events. The ricochet that ended his life illustrated how quickly control could shift, even in situations planned carefully over time. That outcome did not erase what he had built, though it showed that influence does not guarantee control over final results. What remained after that moment was not just the story of one individual, but a structure that continued operating long after the person who shaped it had disappeared.